This is lecture 114B on the capitalist stage in France, the beginning, part of the series The ABCs of Communism that I'm doing right now on YouTube, which is in support of the forthcoming volume 7 on communism in Europe. Now, in November 1789, the judicial system was suspended and abolished altogether. In September 1790, the main institutional pillars of the old regime had vanished overnight. In 1793, the farmers got their land free and no longer would pay the tithe to the church. All that remained of feudal France was the trappings. Yet that was a lot of overburden that had to be disposed of. For the New Englanders, it had meant revolutionary war against the crown, a national war against a foreign power in form. For the French, it would mean a civil war, a war of class against class within the nation. General Lafayette had worked with General George Washington and had a handle on what would have to be done, and he was in charge of what passed for armed forces of the new capitalist stage government. With that as the practical foundation, the bourgeois National Assembly proceeded to act as the legislature and as the constitutional drafting body for a new regime. On 26 August 1789, the National Assembly published the Declaration of Rights of Man and of the Citizen. The idea was to duplicate what the North Americans had done with Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence. Necker, Monnier, and Lally-Tollendal led the overburden. They argued unsuccessfully for a Senate with members appointed by the Crown. The bulk of the nobles argued for an aristocratic upper house elected by the nobles, and it was becoming obvious that the best thing for the people would be to kill all of these anachronisms. For the moment, the revolution would have to be satisfied with passing their own structural measures, including a unicameral legislative body. Meanwhile, the financial crisis had continued unabated. For the moment, the Assembly gave Necker complete financial dictatorship. On the 5th of October 1789, crowds of women began to assemble at Parisian markets. The women first marched to the Hotel de Ville, demanding that city officials relieve the harsh living situation they faced, especially bread shortages. They moved beyond bread and butter issues to the political realm, demanding that the king stop blocking the National Assembly and move to Paris as proof of good faith. 10,000 women then marched to Versailles, armed with small arms and cannons. General Lafayette protected them from attack by reactionary royal forces as the women stormed the palace, killing several of the king's men. Lafayette ultimately persuaded the king to accept the demand of the crowd that the monarchy relocate to Paris. On the 6th of October 1789, the king and his family had no choice but to move from Versailles to Paris. Lafayette escorted them as the legal armed force of the National Assembly. The revolution caused a massive shift of power from the Roman Catholic Church to the state. Under the old order, the Ancien regime, the church had been the largest single landowner in the country, owning about 40% of the land in the kingdom. The church was exempt from paying taxes to the government, but collected a 10% tax on income for itself. Now, farmers without cash were forced to pay in crops. The church gave a sop to the poor in the form of alms on designated days, and not surprisingly, the population hated the church. When the National Assembly enacted social and economic reforms on 4 August 1789 and abolished the church's right to impose taxes, it had no public support. The church had no public support. Now, on 2 November 1789, the Assembly declared that the property of the church was at the disposal of the nation. They used this property to back a new currency called the assignat. Now, the regime took on the task that the church had failed to satisfy in caring for the poor and sick. The government sold church lands to private buyers from the bourgeois class to finance the task of public health and safety. In December 1789, the Assembly began that sale of church lands to the highest bidder to raise that revenue. On the 13th of February 1790, all religious orders were dissolved. Monks, priests, and nuns were encouraged to return to private life and get a job. Some did eventually marry. On the 12th of July in 1790, the remaining clergy became employees of the state. This established an election system for parish priests and bishops and set a pay rate for the clergy. Of course, this effectively denied the authority of the Pope in Rome over the French Church. In October 1790, a group of 30 bishops wrote a declaration saying they would not accept the law. Accordingly, in November 1790, the National Assembly began to require an oath of loyalty to the civil constitution from all the members of the clergy. This led to a schism between those who swore the required oath and accepted the new arrangement and those who did not. Priests swearing the oath were indicated as constitutional, those not taking the oath as illegal clergy. Overall, 24% of the clergy nationwide took the oath. The capitalist government passed a law against the illegal clergy, forcing them into exile or executing them as traitors. Pope Pius VI would never accept the loss of the cash from the church lands and altars that this revolutionary recasting of his church implied. The battle continued to be joined by both sides in a tit-for-tat struggle that featured a Republican calendar in 1793 with 10-day weeks. This made it difficult for those still wishing to be Catholic to remember Sundays and saints' days. Proletarians complained that the new calendar reduced the number of first day of the week holidays from 52 to 37 and asked the National Assembly to add another 15 holidays, which it did. The bourgeois parties, the aristocrat Jacques-Antoine Marie de Cazales and the priest Jean-Séphrin Maury, led the right-wing opposition to revolution, sitting on the right-hand side of the assembly. The Royalist Democrats, or monarchists, led by Necker, wanted the British constitutional model. These included Jean-Joseph Mounier, the Count de Lally-Tollendal, the Count de Clermont-Tonnerre, and Pierre-Victor Malouet, Count de Virou. The National Party, representing the center of the assembly, included Honore Mirabeau, General Lafayette, and Bailly. It encompassed more radical persons such as Adrien Duport, Barnabé, and Alexander Lameth. Alone in his radicalism on the left was the Arras lawyer Maximilien Robespierre. Abbé Sieyès led in proposing legislation and forged a consensus between the political center and the left. Meanwhile, in Paris, various committees, the mayor, the Assembly of Representatives, and the individual districts each claimed authority independent of the others. The increasingly middle-class National Guard under General Lafayette emerged as a power in its own right, as did other self-generated assemblies. The assembly abolished the symbolic paraphernalia of the old order, including the armorial bearings and liveries. This alienated the nobles, sending more of them to foreign lands. On the 14th of July 1790, and for several days following, crowds in the Champ de Mars celebrated the anniversary of the fall of the Bastille. Talleyrand performed a mass. Participants swore an oath of fidelity to the nation, the law, and the king. The king and the royal family participated, as they no longer had any choice. By the terms of the tennis court oath, the communes had bound themselves to meet continuously until France had a constitution. Right-wing elements now argued for a new election. Mirabeau prevailed, asserting that the status of the assembly had fundamentally changed and that no new election should take place before completing the constitution. By November 1790, the French army featured an officer corps of noblemen. Consequently, they found it difficult to maintain order within the ranks. Soldiers drawn from the lower classes turned against the aristocratic commanders and fragged them. At Nancy, General Bull put down a common soldiers' rebellion and was charged with being counter-revolutionary. Mass desertions by officers defecting as émigrés left a temporary absence of experienced leadership within the army. And now the revolution turned left. By 10 August 1790, the Jacobin Club had 152 members. It had begun as the Jacobin Society for Political Debate, and as it grew in membership factions, developing with different views, some broke off to form their own clubs, such as the Club of '89. Meanwhile, the Assembly continued to work on developing a constitution. A new judicial organization made all magistrates temporary and independent of the throne. The legislators abolished hereditary offices except for the monarchy itself. jury trials started for criminal cases, the king would have the unique power to propose war, with the legislature then deciding whether to declare a war. The assembly abolished all internal trade barriers and suppressed guilds, masterships, and workers' organizations. And individuals could practice a trade by purchasing a license, and strikes were prohibited. To recap, as we have seen, the National Assembly had adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen on 27 August 1789. It was the precursor to modern international rights instruments based on the U.S. Declaration of Independence. It defined a set of individual rights and collective rights of all of the estates as one. This was the universal doctrine of natural rights, valid in all times and places, as inherent to human nature. The Assembly also replaced France's historic provinces with 83 departments, uniformly administered and roughly equal to one another in extent and population. Then in October 1789, a mob from Paris had attacked the royal palace at Versailles, seeking redress for their severe poverty. The royal family had been forced to move to the Tuileries Palace in Paris. Under the old order, the Roman Catholic Church had been the largest landowner in the country. In November 1789, the Assembly nationalized and sold all the church's property to address the financial crisis. In July 1790, the Assembly adopted the civil constitution of the clergy that organized the French Catholic Church so that the government would pay the salaries of the priests, and this had abolished the church's authority to tax farmers' crops and canceled ancillary privileges of the clergy. In October 1790, a group of 30 bishops refused to obey the law. The Pope was infuriated at the lost cash. Then the Assembly in November 1790 required that all the clergy take a loyalty oath to the civil constitution, and those refusing were subject to penalty. Now, back to our story. In June 1791, the royal family secretly fled Paris in disguise. They were headed for Varennes, near France's northeastern border, in order to organize the counter-revolution. They were caught, brought back to Paris, and kept under house arrest at the Tuileries. In August 1791, Emperor Leopold II of Austria and King Frederick William II of Prussia prepared their troops to invade France and restore the absolute monarchy. France responded by militarizing its borders. The Assembly had been preparing for a constitutional monarchy rather than a republic, but events had pushed it left. In response to the threat, the leaders of the Assembly and the French people were angry and ready to fight, and thought that they would win a war against Austria and Prussia. On the 3rd of September 1791, the Assembly said France would function as a constitutional monarchy. The king had to share power with the elected Legislative Assembly, although he retained his royal veto and the ability to select ministers. He had to swear an oath to the Constitution. The Assembly declared that should he retract that oath, or head an army to make war upon the nation, or permit anyone to do so in his name, that this would amount to a de facto abdication. Now, the Girondins versus the Jacobins, right versus left. On the 1st of October 1791, the Legislative Assembly was formed, elected by 4 million men out of a population of 25 million, who paid a certain minimum amount of taxes. A group of Assembly members who propagated war against Austria and Prussia was, after a remark by politician Maximilien Robespierre, henceforth designated the Girondins, although not all of them really came from the southern province of Gironde. A group around Robespierre, later called Montagnards or Jacobins, pleaded against war. The opposition between these groups would harden and become bitter in the next 1.5 years. On the 20th of April 1792, France declared war on Austria. In late April 1792, France invaded and conquered the Austrian Netherlands, what are now Belgium and Luxembourg. By summer of 1792, all of Paris was against the king and demanded that the Assembly depose him. However, the Assembly hesitated. At dawn, on the 10th of August 1792, a large, angry crowd of Parisians and soldiers from all over France marched on the Tuileries Palace, where the king resided. Around 8 a.m., the king decided to leave his palace and seek safety with his wife and children in the assembly that was gathered in permanent session in the Salle du Manègue opposite to the Tuileries. After 11 a.m., the assembly relieved the king of his authority. On the 19th of August 1792, an army under Prussian General Duke of Brunswick invaded France and besieged Longwy. On the 26th of August 1792, the assembly deported disloyal priests to the prison colony of French Guiana. The Pope by this time had organized some support, and those loyal to him in the Vendée took over a town. On the 2nd of September 1792, tens of thousands of revolutionary Parisians rose to clear the way for a death match against the counter-revolution. Verdun, being captured by the Prussians, infuriated the masses. They correctly saw that the king and his gang, although incarcerated, had betrayed the nation and consorted with foreign monarchists to restore the old order. The people in arms raided the Parisian prisons and executed about 1,500 counter-revolutionary prisoners, especially Catholic priests. On the 3rd of September 1792, the next day, Jean-Paul Marat, a political ally of Robespierre, in an open letter, incited the rest of France to follow the Parisian example. Robespierre kept a low profile for the moment, as did the Assembly and the City Council of Paris, the Commune. On the 20th of September, the French won a battle against Prussian troops near Valmy, and elections were held for the National Convention, featuring universal male suffrage. The Great Insurrection of 10 August 1792 had created this French government organized as a republic, abandoning the monarchy altogether. The convention sat as a single-chamber assembly from the 20th of September 1792 to the 26th of October 1795. That is 4 Brumaire 4 under the convention's adopted calendar. The convention was divided between the left group around Robespierre, Danton, and Marat, referred to as Montagnards or Jacobins, and the greatest group of Girondins, the remaining representatives referred to as La Plaine. On 21 September 1792, the convention abolished the monarchy, making France a republic. A new French Republican calendar was introduced to replace the Christian Gregorian calendar, renaming the year 1792 as year one of the Republic. Off with their heads. On 21 January 1793, King Louis XVI was executed by guillotine in the Place de la Concorde. In February 1793, a nationwide conscription for the army began. The émigré nobility and priesthood instigated civil war against the Republic. In March of 1793, the French Republic declared war on Spain. That month, the Papist rebels won some victory against Paris, and the French army was defeated in Belgium by Austria when the French Benedict Arnold, General Francois Dumouriez, defected to the Austrians. Extreme measures would be needed if the Republic were to survive. On the 6th of April 1793, the convention created the Committee of Public Safety, composed of 9 men. It was to act as the executive government accountable to the convention. That month, the Girondin groups indicted Jean-Paul Marat before the Revolutionary Tribunal for attempting to destroy the sovereignty of the people and preaching plunder and massacre during September 1792 in the Paris massacres. Marat was quickly acquitted, but the incident further accelerated the Girondins versus Montagnard strife in the convention. In the spring of 1793, Austrian, British, Dutch, and Spanish troops invaded France. On 24 May 1793, Hébert and the convention called on the sans-culottes, that's French for without knee breeches, the patriotic Republican Paris laborers, to rise in revolt against the henchmen of Capet, which is what King Louis XVI name was, according to the convention, his real name, and against the traitor General Francois Dumouriez. The Girondin-dominated convention ordered the arrest of Hébert. The anger of the sans-culottes was then directed at them. On 25 May 1793, a delegation of the Paris City Council protested against Hebert's arrest. The convention's president, Isnard, a Girondin, answered them. Members of the City Council, if by your incessant rebellions something befalls to the representatives of the nation, I declare in the name of France that Paris will be totally obliterated. On 29 May 1793, a papist uprising in Lyon overthrew the Montagnards ruling that city, Marseille, and Toulon. Class war was upon the Republic. On the 2nd of June 1793, the convention session at Tuileries Palace degenerated into pandemonium. This time, crowds of people, including 80,000 armed soldiers, swarmed in and around the palace. Incessant screaming from the public galleries in favor of the Montagnards proved that all of Paris was against the Girondins. Petitions circulated, indicting and condemning 22 Girondins. The Committee of Public Safety demanded that the Girondin leaders quit. Later that day, the convention expelled 22 leading Girondins from the convention. In the course of 1793, the Holy Roman Empire, the kings of Portugal and Naples, and the Grand Duke of Tuscany declared war against France. By the summer of 1793, enemies of the Republic had seized many French departments, and the right-wing Girondins were leading the counter-revolution. Robespierre and Marat now led revolutionary Paris. In July of 1793, Bordeaux, Marseille, Brittany, Cayenne, and the rest of Normandy featured counter-revolutionary armies organized to march on Paris. In July, Lyon guillotined the deposed Montagnard, head of the city council. On 1 August 1793, citizen Bertrand Barrère of the Committee of Public Safety asked the convention for tough measures against the counter-revolution. He said, "We will have peace only when no counter-revolution remains. We will have to exterminate the rebels." Unquote. In August 1793, convention troops besieged Lyon. In early September 1793, militants urged the convention to do more to quell the counter-revolution. A delegation of the Paris City Council asked the convention to form revolutionary armies to arrest hoarders and conspirators. Bertrand Barrère, a leading member of the Committee of Public Safety, reacted favorably, saying, "Let us make terror the order of the day." On September 1793, the National Convention passed the law of suspects and ordered the arrest of all declared opponents of the current form of government and suspected enemies of freedom. Between then and the end of July 1794, 17,000 death sentences were handed out and performed. The guillotine of the revolution was busy. On September 19, 1793, the Papist rebels again defeated a convention army. On the 1st of October 1793, Barrère repeated his plea to subdue the counter-revolution, using every means at its disposal. He said it was the refuge of fanaticism, where priests have raised their altars. Convention troops captured Lyon and reinstated a Montagnard government. On the 14th of October 1793, the former Queen Marie Antoinette was on trial and guillotined 2 days later. In October 1793, 21 former Girondins, convention members, were executed for verbally supporting preparation for insurrection in Cayenne by fellow Girondins. On the 17th of October 1793, the Blue Republican Army near Cholet defeated the White Papist rebel army, and all surviving counter-revolutionary residents, counted in their tens of thousands, fled over the River Loire north into Brittany. A convention's agent on mission in Nantes was sent to pacify the region. He expeditiously drowned counter-revolutionary prisoners in the River Loire. By February 1794, he had drowned at least 4,000. By November 1793, the counter-revolutionary revolts in Normandy, Bordeaux, and Lyon were destroyed. Between November 1793 and April 1794, the Committee for Public Safety in Lyon executed 2,000 people by guillotine or firing squad. On 12 December 1793, the Papist counter-revolutionary army in Brittany was liquidated by Republican troops when 10,000 of its rebels died, putting paid to this counter-revolutionary threat. In December 1793, Toulon was liberated. On the 5th of February 1794, Maximilien Robespierre, in a speech in the convention, identified Jacques Hébert and his faction as internal enemies working toward the triumph of tyranny. After trial, Hébert and some of his allies were guillotined in March. On the 5th of April 1794, again on motion of the convention of Robespierre, Danton, and 13 of their associated politicians were executed. A week later, 19 more politicians met the blade. On the 10th of June 1794, a new law further streamlined criminal procedures if the Revolutionary Tribunal saw sufficient proof of someone being an enemy of the people. Counsel for defense would not be allowed. The frequency of guillotine executions in Paris now rose from an average of 3 a day to an average of 29 a day. Meanwhile, France's external wars were going well. Revolutionary armies had victories over Austrian and British troops in May and June of 1794, opening up Belgium. Now the convention turns to the right. The fight now became one between the poor and working class Parisians and the capitalist alliance within the convention. Robespierre's agent, Collot, said it clearly when Robespierre appointed him to supervise the terror. Their shared interpretation of the principles enshrined in the Declaration of the Rights of Man was that the rights of man are made not for counter-revolutionaries, but only for sans-culottes. Theirs was a far less hypocritical interpretation than that of the slavocrat Thomas Jefferson. This class division was reflected immediately within the Committee of Public Safety. Cooperation with Robespierre began to fail. 3 colleagues of Robespierre on the committee called him a dictator, and Robespierre left the meeting. This encouraged timid convention members to defy Robespierre. On the 26th of July, 1794, a speech of Robespierre was not met with thunderous applause, but with hostility. Some deputies yelled that Robespierre should have the courage to say which deputies he deemed necessary to be killed next, which Robespierre refused to do. On the next day, on the 27th of July, 1794, in the convention, Robespierre and his allies hardly managed to say a word, as they were constantly interrupted by a row of critics such as Tallien, Billaud, Varenne, Badière, Barrère, and acting President Thuriot. Even Robespierre's own voice failed him, and he faltered at his last attempt to beg permission to speak. A decree was adopted to arrest Robespierre, Saint-Just, and Couthon. On the 28th of July, the next day, 1794, they and 19 others were guillotined. On the 29th of July, 1794, 70 Parisians were guillotined. Subsequently, the law of 10 June 1794 was repealed, and the Girondins expelled from the convention in June 1793, if not dead yet, were reinstated as convention deputies. After July 1794, most civilians ignored the Republican calendar and returned to the traditional 7-day weeks. And late in 1794, France conquered present-day Belgium. On the 21st of February 1795, the convention government ordered the return to freedom of religion and reconciliation. However, any religious signs outside churches or private homes, such as crosses, clerical garb, bell ringing, remained prohibited. In January 1795, the Republican armies subdued the Dutch Republic with full consent and cooperation of the influential Dutch Patriots movement, resulting in the Batavian Republic that became a French client state. In 1794 to 1795, the very cold winter witnessed the French army demanding more bread. Bread was getting scarce in Paris, as was wood to keep houses warm. On the 1st of April 1975, a mostly female crowd marched on the convention, calling for bread. However, the convention told the women to return home. In April 1795, France concluded a peace agreement with Prussia, and later that year, peace was agreed with Spain. In May of 1795, a crowd of 20,000 men and 40,000 women marched on the convention, but it failed to address their needs. Instead, the convention banned women from all political assemblies, and deputies who had supported the march were sentenced to death. Which brings us to the Directorate. In October 1795, all priests were ordered to swear oaths to the Republic, and the Republic was reorganized. Replacing the National Convention was a two-house, that is, a bicameral system. The first chamber, called the Council of 500, initiated laws. The second, the Council of Elders, had deciding power over these laws. Each year, one-third of the chambers was to be renewed. The executive power lay with 5 directors, thus the name Directorate. Directors had a 5-year mandate, each year one of them to be replaced. In 1796, French armies advanced into Germany, Austria, and Italy. In 1797, France conquered the Rhineland, the rest of Belgium, much of Italy, and attacked Wales. The spring of 1797 elections produced gains for the Royalists, and this frightened the directors. On the 14th of December 1797, the Directorate staged a self-coup and removed 2 pro-Royalist directors. Along the way, they purged some prominent Royalists from both councils. The new government knew that Catholicism and Royalism were equally dangerous to the Republic. It started a fresh campaign to promote the Republican calendar with its 10-day week, and tried to hallow the 10th day as a substitute for the Christian Sunday. In 1798, France was at war with Egypt, Switzerland, Rome, Ireland, Belgium, and the USA. In 1799, the French armies abroad experienced some setbacks. The newly chosen director, Sieyès, wanted a stronger executive. Together with the victorious General Napoleon Bonaparte, who had just returned to France, Sieyès prepared a coup d'etat. On the 9th to 10th of December 1799, Sieyès' coup replaced the 5 directors with 3 consuls: Napoleon Bonaparte, Sieyès himself, and Roger Ducos. And that brings us to an end of this particular lecture on the French Revolution. Next time we're going to move on to the next lecture on Napoleon and his nephew, Napoleon III.